It didn't stop her from fighting, and it didn't stop her from f***ing either. Hello world, and welcome to my channel, where I share my writing journey, talk about books, and even, on occasion, shake things up. In today's video, I would like to talk about a book that polarized much of the writing community on Authortube, and even led many people to ask questions such as, is Authortube advice any good? And even, is Authortube completely full of shit? If you're interested in exploring these questions in greater detail, I hope that you'll stay tuned for my upcoming video on Authortube and whether or not it was beneficial for the writing community. This video will be dropping in the next couple of weeks. It's a messy topic, and it's bound to make some people unhappy with me. However, I do think it's an important discussion for us to have. For today, however, I'm going to be sticking to reviewing Meg LaTorre's book and discussing how I think this book could have been saved. I would also like to state that while The Cyborg Tinkerer was not my cup of tea, I have not written Meg off as a bad writer, and I would be willing to read her books in the future. Meg seems like a very sweet person, and I can only imagine how stressful it was to work so long and so hard on a book, to put your blood, sweat, and tears into a project, and to build up a platform around it of nearly 100,000 subscribers, only to release it to such bad press. What happened to Meg is every burgeoning writer's nightmare, and because of that, I'm going to stick solely to reviewing her book here, rather than the controversy surrounding this book, i.e. the more sticky, messy, questionable Authortube topics, which I will be covering in my next video. Incidentally, I read this book, or rather listened to this book, as part of a top-secret reading group called The Loin Stream, which you can find on Kirk Pattycake's channel. These are unlisted lives, so the only way you can be a part of them is by subscribing to her channel and then waiting for the notification to drop. If you can make it, it's a whole lot of fun. She basically reads books out loud every single week, and we chime in with our wisecracking in the chat, and it's a lot of fun. I've linked her channel in the description below. I hope to see you there. And lastly, I promise, if you enjoy my work and would like to help support it, please smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment below, and ring that bell. I post new videos every Wednesday, and I would be honored if you would come along with me on this journey as I endeavor to make my writing dreams a reality. Now let's do this. On November 17th, 2020, well-known Authortuber Meg LaTorre published her much-anticipated debut novel, The Cyborg Tinkerer, a book that was billed as an LGBTQ+ steampunk fairy tale mashup with strong science fiction and fantasy elements. Yet when her book finally hit the shelves, many readers found themselves shocked and disappointed with this debut, and there are several reasons for this. For one, this book was marketed as an LGBTQ steampunk fairy tale mashup with strong science fiction and fantasy elements, but what readers got was more akin to a steamy romance, or even a young adult book, with lots of explicit content. This is a marketing distinction that made a substantial difference in how this book was received by the public, and in my opinion, this is a legit grievance for readers to hold. If you say that you are selling someone one thing, and then they pay you money, and you give them something else, it is understandable that many people are going to take issue with your product. And for the record, I don't think this was intentional deception by Meg LaTorre. I think she positioned her book in the marketplace exactly where she thought it needed to be, and it's a shame that she hadn't narrowed down her target genre better, because it probably would have saved her a lot of negative reviews. Furthermore, the book was facing other developmental issues. As I listened, I felt that the story wasn't really building toward anything, that we had many different ideas and potential plot lines and elements from multiple genres all mashed into one book, but this didn't result in a cohesive story. It certainly was a mashup, but it left me feeling confused about how I should be interpreting the text from one moment to the next. I didn't understand the motivations of the characters, and there were many elements of this book that just left me feeling confused as to how I should be feeling. The romance didn't pull me in. And it's possible that this is largely in part due to the fact that polyamory just isn't my thing. But that being said, I just didn't really detect a large amount of chemistry between Bastian and Rora and Gwen. In fact, in the final infamous Ménage à Trois sequence, Bastian explicitly tells Rora that he doesn't really want to be with her physically all the time, that he's all about Gwen and every now and again he'll bring her in to spice things up. Rora felt like a third wheel, someone who was willing to settle for any arrangement that Gwen would agree to because she was so desperate just to be with Gwen at all. And the consent. Dear God, the consent. I touched upon this in my response video to Michael Knowles, which I will go ahead and link in the description below. And I'm gonna go ahead and talk about it a little bit here. The moment things started getting rolling in this scene, if you know what I'm saying, the action stopped and everybody had a big conversation about consent. Wow. I halfway expected Gwen to call up her lawyer and draft a contract stating what positions were allowed and for what amount of time, how much thrusting could happen, when consent expires. I expected people to pull out pens and start signing on dotted lines because it was just that stiff and rigid and... I'm not trying to make an innuendo out of this, but my point is just, it was just so rigidly formal and it completely took me out of the story. It felt like the author was imposing a moral example upon her story, as if she was putting it forward for her readership to take as a lesson somehow, to inculcate people into a view of sexual morality that perhaps the author would like to see become acceptable. And it didn't stop there. This book is a prime example of what many have called diversity checklisting. It is so in vogue now for authors to go out of their way to include representation of every single minority group, sexual identity, gender identity, and the Cyborg Tinkerer piles them in as if doing so will somehow make up for the lack of world building, character development, and chemistry between the main characters. Needless to say, the diversity of this book did not salvage the quality of its storytelling, and the only thing it represented to me was a worrying trend that is taking over almost every sector of our society, which is the need to impose the moral norms, I suppose, of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. I worry that many authors, in their quest to put forward these ideals, are creating an artificial demand for books that readers aren't actually looking for, and in the process are actually preventing authors who don't adhere to this left-wing orthodoxy from getting their own voices heard. I think that publishers are afraid of the loudest, most vocal social justice advocates on social media causing a stir, blacklisting them as racists or some other kind of bigot, and then initiating a large-scale cancellation campaign against them, a campaign fueled by people who are desperate to prove that they are not bigots themselves. I'm not trying to go off on a political rant here, but as I read The Cyborg Tinkerer, I was hit over the head again and again with example after example of the most worrying elements of our current cultural trends in the West, even to the detriment of the story. In my opinion, the storycraft of this book suffered because of the need to cram in as much representation as possible. How about the world building? I don't generally read too much science fiction or fantasy, and I'm not that demanding when it comes to world building details. That being said, The Cyborg Tinkerer didn't answer a lot of the most basic questions I had about this newly constructed fantasy world. For example, how does polyamory fit into this universe? It just seems to be taken for granted that polyamory is a completely typical arrangement between lovers. How did this come to be? How did people come to view a romantic relationship with multiple partners as the norm? Was Gwen raised by parents who were in a polyamorous relationship? If so, or if not, how did this impact her views on love? Has this norm been shaped by religion in any way? How did the religious holy books of the predominant religion, if there is one, because this isn't touched upon in the text either, how did this influence the development of polyamory? This isn't the only place where a bit more development of this world's religious ideas probably would have enhanced the story. We were frequently greeted with expressions like, "Oh my stars," but we were never given any clues as to the theological relevance of the stars in this story. I couldn't help but feel like it was an attempt by the author to make the reader feel more uprooted from their current everyday world. But since there wasn't another world to transplant the reader into, one with even a partially developed history, this attempt just fell flat and left me feeling confused. Another element of this story's world building that threw me off was that while this book has many different planets and landscapes in it, I didn't have any sense of how one planet was different from the next. Consider Earth and how different each and every culture is from each other. How many languages we have, how many different cultures we have, how much history we have. I didn't feel like any of this existed on any planet at all. To me, Anchorage felt exactly the same as Orthodox. Why should we just assume that all of these planets are just uniformly the same in terms of culture and even have anglicized names? Is polyamory accepted on all of these planets? There's another question. This was yet another factor that made me feel like this book was a young adult fantasy romance dressed up as a steampunk LGBTQ mashup. It felt overly simplified and touched upon many themes and issues that seemed to plague young adults more than grown adults. Eating disorders were briefly mentioned in reference to Bastion, but I wasn't clear how this really contributed to the story. If it did, it went right over my head. Additionally, Gwen's insatiable sex drive reminded me of a hormonal teenage boy, and even the cover of this book, the original cover of the book, looked like something out of Treasure Planet. There were also several instances where I thought that the author was writing things that she thought would look cool, but didn't necessarily make sense for the story. The gigantic, big-top, red and white circus tent in the middle of the junkyard containing the highly illegal circus, punishable by death. That was the most glaring example, and right out of the gate. But then there was also the Masquerade Ball that didn't really seem to serve any purpose for the story other than to get Gwen into the infamous Beauty and the Beast yellow dress. Which brings me to Gwen herself. Gwen could have been a very interesting character, but unfortunately, her portrayal was dominated by her being obsessed with her own mortality, at least early on in the book. Gwen is dying, don't you know? Gwen is always dying. As well as her own insatiable libido. I was hoping we would get to know her more than we did. I wanted to understand who she was before she found out that she was going to die from this brain tumor. I wanted to know more about how her view of life changed once she suddenly found out that, hey, I'm gonna live after all. I was hoping that the fact that she got cured of her brain tumor would have changed her trajectory a little. Maybe it would make her value her life more, or change her point of view about her job as a tinkerer, or maybe even make her look beyond just seeking endless pleasures of the flesh. But as far as I could see, from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, Gwen's character appeared unchanged. Gwen also behaved in ways that were emotionally inconsistent with how we were told she felt. In the very first chapter even, she gets the opportunity to have sex with a fellow crew member, but she rejects it because she's feeling down about her own mortality. Pages later, she's getting f***ed by some random dirty lady circus worker in an alleyway. And for the record, I don't remember any verbal consent being expressed in this instance, so if this was meant to be didactic literature, it was inconsistent on this front too. In fact, many of the problems exemplified in the first chapter of this book serve as an example of exactly what went wrong in this book as a whole. There was just so much going on that it was impossible for me to know, from moment to moment, how I should be feeling. And because of this, I didn't feel like the text was building toward anything. This book attempted to do many things, but because of this, it didn't really accomplish anything at all. At least not for me. So how would I have improved the Cyborg Tinkerer? I feel like the most effective way that Meg could have improved this book would have been to make sure that the main characters show a meaningful development over the course of the story, that their actions are consistent with how they say that they're feeling, to include details that make sense for the story and not just because they look cool, and to have characters suffer meaningful consequences as a result of their decisions in the book. Even the menage a trois at the end happened after Gwen had been shot several times and had broken her leg. It didn't stop her from fighting, and it didn't stop her from f***ing either. I just didn't feel like there were any negative consequences that had any impact on the characters whatsoever, and that just ruined the suspense for me. It just felt too safe. It's just gonna work out okay no matter what happens to anybody. If these factors have been taken care of, as well as enriching the world building to include at least a basic foundation for us to understand this fictional universe, as well as marketing this book under the correct genre so that way the correct people could find it and enjoy it, I think this book would be well on its way to delighting readers and helping Meg build a lasting fan base. Thank you for listening to me. And now, I would like to listen to you. What did you think about Meg LaTorre's The Cyborg Tinkerer? Did this book make you consider how you approach certain topics within your own writing? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you. If you enjoy my work and would like to support it, please like this video, comment below, subscribe to my channel, and ring that bell. I post new videos every Wednesday where I share my writing journey, talk about books, and even, on occasion, shake things up. And I would love it if you would come along with me on this journey. I'll see you in my next video. Thank you.